He believed he was divine, untouchable, eternal. But gods aren't buried in unmarked graves. Caligula's last days were a firestorm of insanity, cruelty, and decay. Behind the velvet curtains of power, Rome plotted, and when the knife finally fell, it wasn't justice, it was vengeance. What do you do with a god who forgets he's mortal? You remind him, with 30 blades to the chest. His empire didn't just kill him, it erased him. Before the blood, before the madness, there was hope. Caligula, born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, was a child of destiny, the son of Germanicus, Rome's most beloved general. He was raised among the legions on distant battlefields. As a boy, he wore a miniature soldier's uniform, including tiny boots. The soldiers adored him. They called him Caligula, Little Boots. The name stuck. So did the affection. When Emperor Tiberius died in AD 37, the empire erupted in celebration. Caligula's ascension was seen as the dawn of a golden age. He opened the prisons, invited exiles back, held lavish games, and distributed generous gifts. Statues of his family, once condemned, were restored to places of honor. The Senate called him our beloved prince. The people hailed him as a savior. For the first time in years, Rome felt joy. Then he fell ill. A sudden fever nearly killed him. Some whispered poison. Others called it divine punishment. For weeks he drifted between life and death. When he finally rose from his bed, the cheers returned. But something had changed. The smile was there, but the warmth behind it was gone. Caligula spoke of immortality, of destiny, of divinity. He wasn't just emperor. He said he was a god. Temples to his name began to rise. Statues of Jupiter were refaced with his likeness. Senators were ordered to kneel. Sacrifices were made in his honor. To defy him wasn't just treason. It was blasphemy. The boy in boots was dead. What remained was something new, something dangerous. He ruled not through policy or tradition, but through awe and fear, and the quiet belief that no blade could touch him. And Rome, ever adaptable, bowed to the man who declared himself divine. But what happens when a god forgets mercy and begins to feast on the fear of his own people? The palace grew quieter after nightfall, but not with peace. Servants walked on tiptoe. Courtiers whispered in corners. Every breath inside the imperial walls felt borrowed, because behind the marble, columns and golden ceilings, something in Caligula had broken. He began speaking to the moon, not in metaphor, but in full conversations, gesturing, pausing, waiting for replies. He wandered the palace barefoot at night, laughing, muttering, sometimes weeping. No one dared ask why. To question was to disappear. The old Caligula had vanished. What remained was a man possessed by delusions and paranoia. He believed plots swirled around him at all times, so he struck first. Friends were summoned and executed without warning. Senators were forced to attend ceremonies where they watched the execution of their peers and clap. He grew obsessed with control, not just over politics, but over perception. He rewrote laws in the middle of speeches, changed the calendar to suit his whims, declared that no one could look down on him. Even from a balcony, citizens in tall buildings were ordered to seal their windows when he passed. His cruelty deepened. A man once praised for his voice was sliced through the throat, just so Caligula could watch him bleed. He ordered a noblewoman's husband killed, then took her to dinner that same evening. He joked about it. No one laughed. Even Rome's sacred traditions were not safe. He desecrated temples, dressed as Venus, declared himself all gods in one. The divine mask had fused with the man. To outsiders, the empire still functioned. Taxes were collected, grain was delivered, but inside the palace, Rome's emperor was unspooling at the seams, dragging the empire with him. Because now, the palace would become his stage, and Rome would scream on cue. The Roman Senate had once been the empire's engine, its place of debate, law, and legacy. Under Caligula, it became a slaughterhouse wrapped in marble. He no longer governed by reason or law. He ruled by whim, and whim often bled. The Senate, once proud and stubborn, now bowed without question. For one question too many could end with a dagger across the throat. The emperor didn't need reasons to destroy a man. He only needed to be bored. He converted trials into performances, where guilt was predetermined and death was inevitable. The accused were paraded before senators and guests like criminals in a gladiatorial match, stripped of dignity before they were stripped of life. Caligula presided not as judge, but as God, his golden robe trailing across the marble floor, his face lit by torchlight as he passed sentence with the flick of a finger. Executions were no longer private affairs. They were events, entertainment. He once hosted a banquet where, between roasted boar and sweet wine, a nobleman was dragged out and beaten to death in full view of the guests. Caligula watched with delight, offering commentary as if critiquing a play. No one dared to flinch, no one dared to leave. Some choked back bile, others choked back tears. He forced the entire Senate to attend, clapping when the man stopped moving. This was not justice. It was humiliation weaponized. He found pleasure in contradiction. He'd greet a senator warmly, honor him publicly, then order his execution the same night. He pardoned men with grand ceremony, then withdrew the pardon mid-scroll as soldiers closed in. A poet praised his eyes once. The next morning, the man was found hanged. A placard beside his corpse, "Let all poets write of Jupiter with caution." He mocked the tears of widows, confiscated the wealth of those he killed. If a man had land or influence, he became a target. Caligula claimed Rome had too many rich men. He corrected the problem, one beheading at a time. And then came Incitatus. His beloved horse, white, sleek, and pampered beyond reason, was housed in a marble stable. He dined on gilded oats, drank from goblets, and wore a collar of amethysts. Caligula made him a priest. Then, with perfect madness, he declared his intention to name him consul. It was absurd. It was terrifying. To the Senate, it wasn't a joke. It was a threat. If a horse could hold their highest office, what were they? Nothing but props in his grotesque pageant. They played along, of course. They applauded, smiled, laughed when expected, and quietly arranged for their sons to be far from Rome. But fear has a saturation point. The more unpredictable Caligula became, the more dangerous his loyalty seemed. No one was safe, not childhood friends, not military heroes, not family. Each day, senators woke wondering if they would still be breathing by sundown. Even the Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect the emperor, began to watch him differently. Whispers began to pass between clenched jaws in the corridors of power. Not loud enough to be heard, but just loud enough to be felt. Servants, soldiers, and scribes learned not to speak his name aloud unless offering praise. And even that came with risk. No one could guess what Caligula would find offensive on any given morning. The emperor had turned Rome's governing class into a cabal of trembling sycophants. Their robes were crimson, their homes grand, but their eyes told the real story. They were prisoners in gold chains, and Caligula held the key. He thought himself invincible, eternal, above all consequences. But there's a truth every tyrant forgets. The more blood they spill, the more hands begin to reach for a blade. Because even monsters cast shadows, and in those shadows, something ancient was stirring, the will to survive, and the courage to kill a god. It began with silence, a sideways glance, a pause too long, a sentence cut short in the halls of the Senate. In Caligula's Rome, survival depended on silence, but silence has a sound of its own, a rustling beneath the surface, like dry leaves, before a storm. And in that storm, Rome's first whispers of rebellion were born. The emperor had pushed too far. He humiliated senators, bankrupted nobles, executed men without warning, and called it justice. He crossed every sacred line, family, religion, even nature. He desecrated temples, claimed to sleep with the moon, threatened to make his horse not just a consul, but a god. Rome had suffered emperors before, Tiberius with his paranoia, Augustus with his iron fist, but none had treated the empire like a toy in a child's hands. Caligula was not feared like a ruler. He was feared like a wildfire, uncontrollable, unreasoning, merciless, and fires eventually must be smothered. It began with Cassius Chaerea, a Praetorian officer long mocked by Caligula. He was known for his stoic discipline and quiet loyalty. Caligula, ever cruel, enjoyed humiliating him in public. He called him names, assigned him degrading duties, forced him to repeat orders in a falsetto voice, mocking his masculinity. Sharia bore it all without flinching. But beneath the armor, something cold and patient was taking shape. He was not alone. Senators who had lost friends, brothers, fortunes, nobles whose wives had been taken, guards who had once sworn to protect Caesar, but now stared at their spears and wondered. The cruelty had united them, the madness had sharpened them, and so the whisper network formed. Meetings took place under the guise of religious festivals, funerals, and private dinners. Nothing written, no names spoken unless necessary. If Caligula even suspected disloyalty, entire families could disappear. So they whispered and planned. They studied his movements, his routes, his routines. They learned that Caligula often walked alone to the Palatine Games, flanked only by a handful of bodyguards. It was a narrow corridor, no windows, stone walls, one entrance, one exit, a perfect kill box. But killing a god required more than blades. It required resolve. Some hesitated. What if it failed? What if he survived and retaliated with even greater fury? What if Rome fell into chaos? But Sharia knew the truth. Chaos had already come. Rome was bleeding beneath its golden skin. The emperor was not just mad. He was a contagion. Every day he lived, the soul of Rome withered. Still, they waited until a sign came, not from the gods, but from Caligula himself. At a public feast, he rose mid-speech and announced that he would move the imperial capital from Rome to Alexandria. He wanted to be worshipped as a living god among the temples of Egypt. He planned to strip the Senate of all remaining power, to dissolve Rome's centuries-old institutions, to erase the old gods, the old rules, and replace them with one name, his. That night, the whispers turned to action. The plan was simple, precise, brutal. The day of the Palatine Games would be the day Rome took back its soul. When Caligula passed through that stone corridor, they would strike. Not once, not twice, dozens of times. There would be no speeches, no final warnings, only steel and silence. They agreed on one thing above all else. If they were to kill a god, they must kill him completely. And yet, even as their blades were sharpened and their minds set, none of them could predict what would come next. Not just the act, but the chaos that would follow. Gods, after all, do not die quietly. And as Rome held its breath, the gods fell silent, because the blood of an emperor was about to stain the stones beneath their feet. Even gods feel fear. In the final weeks before his death, Caligula's eyes began to shift, darting faster, scanning shadows, locking on figures no one else could see. He had once walked Rome with arrogance, but now he moved with the predators. Caution. Something had changed. Something haunted him. The whispers had not yet reached his ears, but Rome itself seemed to whisper louder. Unexplainable things began to happen. Statues in the Forum were found cracked at the neck. A lightning bolt struck the Capitoline temple during a midnight storm. A sacred bull, meant for sacrifice in Caligula's honor, collapsed and died before reaching the altar. In the marketplace, a mad soothsayer screamed that Jupiter was angry. In the Senate, a raven flew through the oculus and landed on the emperor's empty throne. The augurs called it a divine message. Caligula called it nonsense. But he didn't sleep that night. His dreams turned violent. He dreamt of rivers of blood flowing from the Palatine Hill. He dreamt of being torn apart by animals in the amphitheater. He awoke drenched in sweat, gasping for air. For the first time in years, the Emperor of Rome looked mortal. And then came the silences. The people of Rome, once so easily cowed into obedience, had begun to quiet, not in fear, but in anticipation. Citizens passed him in the street without the forced joy they once displayed. Senators bowed, but their smiles were hollow. His guards, once vigilant, now seemed distracted, detached. Caligula noticed, and he responded with terror. He doubled his sacrifices. Dozens of animals were slaughtered in a single day. He ordered random executions just to cleanse the city of ill omens. He consulted astrologers, burned scrolls, and had 2 augurs publicly flogged for lying to the stars. He even began speaking to the gods aloud, pleading, bargaining, cursing. One night, standing beneath a full moon, he screamed into the sky, "You will not take me, I am your equal." But the sky did not answer. His nightmares worsened. In one, he stood alone in a great hall of mirrors, his own reflection laughing, multiplying, devouring him. In another, he wandered a scorched Rome, where no one recognized him, and no temple would take him in. He became convinced that death was near, but not from a man, from something else. That he summoned magicians, Egyptian priests. He began wearing amulets beneath his robes. He stopped sleeping in the same room twice in a row. Some nights, he paced the palace corridors until dawn, refusing food, muttering to himself. Yet for all the horror he projected, he could not escape the thing that had begun to form in the corner of every room he entered. The sense that his empire, his divine empire, was slipping out from under him. Still, he prepared one final show. The Palatine Games would be his triumph, a festival of blood and power, a stage to remind Rome that their gods still ruled. He ordered golden chariots, imported lions from Africa, called for sacred dancers from the east. He would walk the sacred corridor alone, in full imperial regalia, with a laurel crown on his head and thunder in his voice. It would be his rebirth. But behind the walls, where torches flickered low, his enemies waited. They knew the corridor, they knew the hour, and they had counted the steps. Caligula saw the signs. He felt the weight of his dreams, the chill in his bones, the silence in the eyes of those around him. But he did not stop. He could not. Because what is a god who retreats? What is a god who fears the dark? He was no longer man, no longer flesh. He told himself he was divinity, immortal, but deep in his heart, beneath the madness and delusion, something ancient and primal stirred. Doubt. Yet even gods must walk through corridors, and Caligula was about to step into one that no light would ever reach again. Caligula was never content to rule. He needed to be worshipped. And so, on the eve of the Palatine Games, he staged a feast that would echo through the ages. It was not just a dinner, it was theater, a ritual, a warning. The invitations were personal. Selected senators, generals, foreign envoys, men he trusted, men he hated, and men he suspected, especially them. The great hall of the imperial palace was lit by 1,000 oil lamps, their flames flickering like spirits against the polished marble walls. Gold draped every surface. The air was thick with incense and wrought. The emperor arrived in full regalia, draped in a robe sewn with pearls, crowned with a laurel of gilded ivy, and flanked by dancers painted as gods. He entered to the sound of cymbals and flutes, smiling with lips that barely concealed the crackling storm beneath. Guests stood. They bowed. They praised him as divine. He said nothing. The feast began with silence. Peacocks roasted whole, honey glazed, dormice, bowls of grapes soaked in wine. Everything was lavish, excessive, obscene, and yet no one ate with ease. Every bite might be their last. Every glance might be misinterpreted. Servants moved like ghosts. Soldiers stood behind every column. Somewhere, they all knew this was not a celebration. It was a performance. Caligula sat at the head of the table, watching. He whispered to his cupbearer, laughed at private jokes, occasionally leaned over to speak into the ear of a senator, who would pale visibly and nod with forced amusement. He toasted to eternity, to divinity, to himself. Then came the speeches. He stood and raised his goblet, the room falling to a hush. His voice, soft at first, grew sharper as he spoke of loyalty, betrayal, and divine punishment. He recited the names of men who had wronged the gods, some of whom were seated in that very room. He spoke of a future Rome, reborn in his image, a Rome free from cowards and conspirators. The room was still, the guests frozen in their chairs. Then laughter. Caligula laughed, loud and long, as if it were all a joke. And just like that, the tension snapped, the music returned, the dancers spun, the senators exhaled. But no one believed it was over. The feast continued, more frantic now. Wine spilled, voices rose in false cheer. A foreign envoy dropped his goblet and was dragged from the room by guards. No one asked why. No one ever did. And through it all, Caligula watched, He didn't need to kill anyone that night. Fear did. The killing for him, the silence between the toasts, the forced smiles, the sweat on noble brows, these were the weapons he loved most. He didn't command Rome with legions anymore. He ruled with dread. As the night deepened, he rose once more and declared the Palatine Games would begin at dawn. He promised a spectacle never before seen by gods or men. He spoke of lions, gladiators, and miracles. But the miracle had already happened. Rome had survived the night, or so they thought. At the end of the feast, Caligula stepped down from his golden days. No guards flanked him now. He walked alone through the grand hall, robes trailing behind him, his sandals tapping gently on stone. He nodded to guests, touched the heads of children, smiled at wives, to anyone watching. He was serene, magnificent. Invincible. But behind every smile in that room was a secret, and in the walls of the palace, steel was being unsheathed. The conspirators had made their final vows. They knew the hour, they knew the corridor, they knew the path he would walk, and they knew that gods do not bleed until they do, because in the belly of the palace, death was already waiting, with 30 blades and number gods to stop it. The gods were silent on the morning of January 24th, 41 AD. Caligula awoke early. As he often did before public games, the Palatine sky was pale and cloudless, a good omen. He thought. He bathed, dressed in a white tunic stitched with golden suns, and crowned himself with a laurel of gilded ivy. He admired his reflection, nodding at the face that had once adorned statues of Jupiter. Today, the people would worship him again. He chose to walk to the theater, unaccompanied by fanfare. No litter, no music, only a small escort of attendants and Praetorian guards. He called it divine humility. Others called it arrogance. It was, in truth, a deadly mistake. The path led through a private passage behind the palace, a narrow corridor carved of stone, windowless and silent. It was dim, the torches along the walls flickering lazily as if exhausted by the emperor's weight. Waiting inside was Cassius Chaerea. He had positioned himself precisely, sword concealed beneath his cloak, jaw set with grim purpose. For years, Caligula had humiliated him, called him effeminate, forced him to repeat orders in a falsetto, reduced a seasoned officer to a palace joke. But Chaerea was no joke now. As Caligula entered the corridor, his laughter echoed. "Another chore, Chaerea," he said, barely glancing his way. "Careful not to drop your little sword." There was no reply, only steel. In one swift motion, Chaerea plunged his blade into the emperor's side. Caligula gasped, eyes wide. He staggered backward, gripping his wound. He turned, mouth open, but no command came. Another assassin struck, then another. The corridor exploded in chaos. Blades flashed in the dim light. Caligula screamed, tried to run, but his feet slipped in blood. One conspirator slashed across his chest. Another stabbed him in the thigh. His knees buckled. He reached for a guard. The man stepped aside. Caligula fell, shrieking, crawling, begging. He shouted for the gods, for help, for mercy. But mercy was never part of the plan. This wasn't a killing. It was a ritual, a punishment, a reckoning. The conspirators swarmed him. Swords pierced flesh again and again. His hands were slashed, his face split open. One blade stabbed directly through his jaw, pinning his tongue. Still he gurgled. Still he flailed. Blood sprayed across the corridor walls. Cassius Chaerea stood above him, face pale but steady. "Strike again," he commanded. "Kill the god." They obeyed. It took over 30 wounds to end him. By the time they stopped, Caligula was unrecognizable. His robe was shredded, his limbs twisted. His crown lay beside him, gleaming in a pool of blood. The Emperor of Rome, the self-declared god, was dead. There was no thunderclap, no divine voice. The gods, if they existed, remained silent. The assassins stood motionless for a moment, as if unsure what they had done. Some breathed heavily. One vomited. Another knelt to close the emperor's vacant eyes. They had not just killed a man, they had slaughtered a symbol. A storm of footsteps echoed from behind. For a split second, the conspirators reached for their blades again. But it was only more of their own. Word had already begun to spread. Caligula was dead. The tyrant had fallen. The god had bled. But as they looked at the body, a new fear crept in. What now? What would Rome do without its emperor? And more dangerously, what would Rome do to the men who had murdered him? Because when a god falls, vengeance doesn't wait for justice. And Rome was about to answer with fire. He was dead. His body lay twisted on the cold stone floor, limbs askew, face torn open by blades. The man who once paraded as Jupiter on earth now bled like any other mortal, his golden robe soaked through, his laurel crown crushed beneath the soldier's boot. But death wasn't the end, because a god's death leaves behind ghosts. Word spread through the palace like fire. Guards, servants, officials, none knew whether to flee or fall to their knees. Some wept, some cheered, most simply stood in stunned silence, their lives dependent on who gained power next. The conspirators stood over the body, breathing heavily, waiting for something, divine punishment, angry gods, lightning from the heavens. Nothing came. There was only blood. And then came the next question. What of his family? Caligula's wife, Caesonia, and their young daughter, Julia Drusilla, were still alive. The conspirators hesitated. Killing an emperor was one thing, but a woman, a child? Cassius Sharia didn't hesitate. He ordered it immediately. If the root remains, he said coldly. The rot returns. They found Caesonia in her chambers, clutching the child in her arms. Her hair was unbound, her face pale. She had heard the screams. She knew what they meant. When the soldiers entered, she did not run. She stood, holding her daughter tighter. Spare the child, one soldier whispered. She is innocent. Sharia stepped forward. There is no innocence in divine blood. They struck Caesonia down first, a single sword through the chest. She fell without a sound. Her daughter screamed, wriggling from her arms, crawling toward the corner. What happened next? No historian recorded in detail that, but everyone knew. The child was no more than 2. Some say she was thrown against a wall. Others say a sword was used. All agree on one thing. Her blood ran alongside her mother's before the hour was out. The butchering was complete. The god, the goddess, the divine heir. Erased. The conspirators ordered the bodies removed, not honored, not embalmed, dumped in a shallow grave outside the city. A servant, loyal even in horror, later returned to retrieve them under nightfall. They were given a secret burial, far from the capital, far from memory. The empire had not simply assassinated its emperor. It had exterminated him, erased him. Caligula's statues were torn down, his name chiseled from monuments. Coins bearing his face were melted into blanks. Public documents referred to him only as the late tyrant. It was as if he had never lived. But Rome could not forget what it had done. The Senate reconvened. In chaos, some senators celebrated, others trembled. Had the murder gone too far? Was this a righteous act or a desecration? What message had been sent to the gods? And more urgently, who would rule next? Without an emperor, Rome hovered at the edge of anarchy. In the meantime, the city boiled. News of Caligula's death divided the people. Some rejoiced openly, shouting praises to the conspirators in the streets. Others mourned, genuinely believing he had been divine. Still others said nothing, waiting to see who would bleed next. At the barracks, the Praetorian Guard seethed. Caligula had been their emperor, their benefactor, their shield. His murder had taken place under their watch. Some demanded vengeance, others demanded leadership. What they all agreed on, something had to fill the vacuum. That answer came sooner than expected, because not all of Caligula's blood had spilled that day. And one final surprise waited behind the palace curtains. For in a shadowed chamber, trembling, beneath a table, sat a man no one expected, and Rome was about to crown its next emperor. The gods were gone. The tyrant lay dead, his wife and child butchered. Rome had erased its monster, but in doing so, it created a void, and vacuums and empires do not stay empty for long. The Senate believed it could seize control. In the hours after Caligula's death, they gathered urgently, eager to restore the Republic. Speeches were made, proclamations drafted. The Golden Age, they declared, would return. Rome would be ruled by law, not lunacy, But Rome wasn't listening. While senators debated, the Praetorian Guard acted. Their loyalty had never truly belonged to the Senate. It had belonged to power, and with Caligula gone, they were left humiliated, betrayed. Their emperor had been murdered in their own halls, their prestige tarnished by cowardice and conspiracy. Worse, the Senate had not consulted them, had not warned them, had not included them. They wanted revenge. And they found it, hiding behind a curtain. Claudius, the uncle of Caligula, lame, stammering, mocked for years as a fool and a cripple. He had survived precisely because no one had taken him seriously. But in the chaos following the assassination, he had fled, trembling, and concealed himself behind a tapestry in the palace. A guardsman found him kneeling, weeping, clutching his cloak. He was not executed, he was saluted. The Praetorians proclaimed him emperor that same evening. The Senate was outraged. This was not their plan, but outrage meant nothing now. Claudius, the stammering shadow, had been placed atop the throne not by blood or by vote, but by sword. And with him came vengeance. Caligula's assassins had assumed they would be heroes, that Rome would crown them saviors. Instead, they became hunted men. In the days that followed, Praetorian justice swept through the city. Blades found throats in alleyways. Heads rolled into the Tiber. Cassius Chaerea was captured first. He stood trial before Claudius, who had once been mocked by him and his fallen nephew alike. Chaerea defended himself with pride, claiming he had struck not for ambition, but for the good of Rome. Claudius nodded. Then ordered his execution. Chaerea was forced to kneel. The same sword he had driven into Caligula's side was now used on him. His head was displayed briefly before being discarded like waste. Others followed. Some conspirators fled the city, but few escaped. The guards who had hesitated during the assassination were tortured until they gave names. Friends turned informants. Wives turned widows. The retribution was swift and merciless. The people of Rome watched with morbid awe. They had hated Caligula, but they feared disorder more. And now, with the executions mounting, they began to whisper a new name with caution: Claudius. The ghost in the palace had become Caesar. But vengeance did not stop with the conspirators. Caligula's legacy, what little remained of it, had to be cleansed. His statues were pulled from storage and burned. His writings destroyed. His name struck from every public record. The Senate passed a decree: let no monument bear his image. Let no child be named for him. Let the memory of the tyrant perish. Yet it didn't, because memory cannot be executed. Servants still spoke of the night screams. Mothers still warned their children of little boots. And deep beneath the marble and ceremony, the horror of Caligula's reign still echoed. Claudius knew this, and it haunted him. He had not wanted the throne. He had not earned it. He had survived it, and in surviving, he inherited the blood-soaked crown of a madman. His reign would be built on bones. But for now, he ruled. Rome bled. Rome bowed. And above the forum, where once Caligula's statue had towered, the pedestal now stood empty, cracked, abandoned, and stained with the rain of 1,000 whispered curses. But history remembers what marble cannot, and the echo of Caligula's name was not done haunting Rome just yet. They erased him. After Caligula's death, Rome waged a second war, not with swords, but with silence. His name was chiseled from inscriptions. His statues were shattered and buried. Official records listed him only as the last tyrant. His image, once cast in gold, was melted down and recast into coins bearing new, safer faces. It wasn't enough. The Senate passed a motion of damnatio memoria, the condemnation of memory, the ultimate punishment, to be forgotten by history, to be erased so completely that even one's ghost would struggle to haunt. But Caligula was no ordinary ghost. Despite their efforts, his presence lingered, in whispers, in shadows, in the cracks between memory and myth. Those who had lived through his reign could not forget. They spoke of him only in hushed tones, never directly, never without fear. Parents warned their children, speak the truth, or you'll end up like those who displeased the mad god. Servants told stories of secret executions, of senators dragged screaming from banquets, of a man who claimed to rule the moon and sun alike. Caligula had ruled for just 4 years, But the scars he left ran deep into the law, the palace, the soul of Rome itself. Claudius, his reluctant successor, governed with care. He reinstated senatorial power, restored order, and opened the doors of the palace again. He tried to calm the fever that had gripped the empire, but he did so under the shadow of the man who had come before him. Every decree Claudius made was haunted. Every celebration reminded the people of the excesses they had only recently survived. Even his public appearances were cautious, carefully staged to avoid comparison. Where Caligula had dressed as a god, Claudius walked like a servant. Still, the whispers returned, because tyranny, once witnessed, is not easily forgotten. Some believed Caligula had not truly died, that he had faked his murder and would return. Others said his spirit had entered the palace itself, cursing every emperor who followed. A few claimed to hear laughter in the marble halls at night, cruel and sharp, echoing without a source. The empire moved on, but never fully recovered. Caligula had changed Rome. He had proved that one man's madness could poison an entire civilization, that worship could become slavery, that fear could become law. And beneath all the efforts to erase him, a darker truth settled into the foundation of Roman power. It had allowed him, it had fed him, it had bowed to him. The same Senate that condemned him had once praised him. The same people who now spat at his name had once thrown roses at his feet. He hadn't been an invader. He had been a mirror, and Rome had not liked what it saw. Centuries later, historians would debate whether Caligula had truly gone mad, or simply played mad in a game for control, whether his acts were symptoms of illness or strategies of dominance, whether the horrors were exaggerated by his enemies or understated by those too afraid to record the truth. But one fact remained: no emperor before him had pushed the boundaries of humanity and godhood so far, and no emperor after him would ever quite escape his shadow. Not Nero, not Domitian, not even those who ruled in the empire's twilight. All bore the mark of Caligula, directly or indirectly, as a symbol of how quickly Rome could slide into darkness. He became a warning, a story parents told, a figure scribbled in the margins of forbidden books, a name rarely spoken, but never truly silenced. He wanted to be remembered as a god. He was remembered as something else entirely, a curse. He believed he was immortal, and in a way, he was, because long after the marble crumbled and the empire fell, the world still whispers the name of Caligula and shudders.